Hello, and first time in a while that I've been here because a hefty dose of real life happened to me, and I'm now changing a lot more nappies than I was before. Anyway, I've finally found some time to record some more videos, and we're going back to the Target books that were released earlier this year, and I'm going to be talking about Crimson Horror and Dalek. I've paired them together, partly because I read them consecutively, partly because they're the two new series ones left, but also because they both do something interesting with the word count that each of the authors has been given. Now, these new novels are some of the longest that have ever been in the Target range, and obviously they are generally novelising stories that are half the length of a standard classic four-parter, and obviously some of the Target novelisations from the past are novelising, in the case of the War Games, 10 episodes into a much shorter space. And I don't know whether it was the fact that both Mark Gatiss and Rob Shearman struggled to fill the word count, but they're both doing something interesting with what they've been given. In the case of Mark Gatiss, you get the first third of the novel is nothing that we saw on screen. It's essentially a standalone story of how the Doctor first met Jenny, because the story is told from her point of view. In the case of Rob Shearman, he devotes almost half the length of the novel to little vignettes of backstory for most of the major characters, which means that only about 100 pages of the 180 pages are dedicated to telling the story that we saw on screen. So with that said, I'm briefly going to talk about the Crimson Horror. First, this was a story that I disliked on original broadcast. I'm generally a fan of Mark Gatiss's Doctor Who. I think he clearly has sensibilities that push my buttons in terms of what I like in Doctor Who stories. And this is clearly a happy place for him, the sort of Victorian era stuff, the horror of it. And that's just not my kind of thing. And I really didn't like it. I've probably seen it twice, I think. Saw it on original broadcast maybe once since. Was not a fan. Really, the novelisation of this, it could only go up in my estimation, and I did enjoy this. I mean, it's still the same story. As I say, the first third is a fresh story, essentially, set in that world. It's set in London. It's just the Doctor, no Clara, and it's told primarily from Jenny's point of view. I'd heard before I started reading this that this book was very much like the Romans. It's sort of, but not really, in that the Romans gives you little snippets of the diaries of several characters throughout that story, whereas this is mostly Jenny. There's a change of style that she acknowledges when she's narrating bits that she's not there for, and there are little bits from other sources. It's less of that style, but it's nice to have it predominantly from her perspective. Unlike Joy Wilkinson, who clearly listened to the criticism of the Witchfinders and fixed that one line, see my review, if you haven't seen my review of that, Mark Gatiss is either unaware of the criticisms that were levelled at this story, or he doesn't care. So the Doctor kissing Jenny is still in. Jerusalem being sung 20 odd years before the tune was written is still in. And the sat-nav joke is still in. So if you dislike those things about the televised episode, they're not any different in the book. A few other things to say about it. One of the things about reading new series stories as novelizations is it's easy to forget initially that they were part of an arc of a season on TV. In this case, the whole kind of mystery of who Clara was. It's very easy to forget that, particularly with this, because of the extra 60 pages at the beginning with no Clara in at all. Because Clara doesn't feature heavily in the Crimson Horror on TV, it takes a very long time for her to actually turn up in the story, and you almost forget that she's there. And then at that point, you're like, oh yeah, Jenny and Vastra think she's dead, because that was the whole arc. So it is a bit odd, sort of being pulled back into that arc when the book itself needs to stand alone. I mean, that's not a major problem, but it's just a reminder. Like, oh yeah, actually this had a context on TV, which it no longer has as a book. Unless, of course, they do get around to novelising every single TV story, and eventually you can read these all in that vein. But it won't, I suspect it won't have that kind of overarching eye over it to make sure that the thread works as a series of novels. The other thing that this novel sort of sets up is that the prequel story and the way that it rounds out, there's a sort of overarching bigger story that feels like it's setting up like, oh, Mark Gatiss could do a whole series of stories with this other. I don't want to spoil it, but there's a sort of an even bigger kind of narrative going on, of which Mrs. Gilliflower is a part, and this feels like it's setting something up. But I'm like, I don't know where that could go. I mean, it's perhaps one of those loose ends that's like, oh well, that's just never going to be tied up. It's an interesting extra. But overall, a much better experience for me than watching the TV version. It hasn't made me want to go back and watch the TV version again. I think I would probably, if for future reference, if I wanted to experience the Crimson Horror again, I would read the book. And so we come to Dalek, which I suppose is a reverse, really, in that it's one of my favourite Doctor Who stories of the new series. I guess probably ever, really. But certainly from the new era. Very fond memories of watching it originally with a bunch of uni mates who didn't really get the significance of the Dalek coming back, but I didn't care. The Daleks have largely been a law of diminishing returns throughout the new series. But this is where it started in terms of bringing them back. And it's a very good story. So, and I'd read lots of people reading this and going, it was great. So it's a shame I didn't really enjoy it. And most of that is probably down to me. What I didn't enjoy about it were the fact that these little kind of short vignettes of backstory that are dotted throughout the narrative are quite dark and unpleasant, because you're dealing with dark and unpleasant people for the most part that fill that story. And I'm well aware that since writing Doctor Who, Rob Shearman seems to have specialised in short story collections of weird and macabre stuff, and because of that I haven't read any of them, because I'm like, I know that's not going to be my cup of tea. I actually tweeted that I was struggling to get through this novel, and I deliberately didn't tag him, but he saw it and started following me on Twitter. So if you're watching, Rob, hello. And he's one of those, because I met him years ago at a convention and did an interview for a podcast. He's one of those people that writes grim stuff, but is the loveliest person in person. It's a bit of a cliche, really, but it's true. So yeah, so I just didn't enjoy those stories. And you, for example, you in the TV version, you hear about the fact that the last person before Rose could touch the Dalek burst into flame and died. Well, you get that in all its gory detail in the book, and I'm like, I wasn't really wanting to read about that. Which is not to say that Target hasn't gone there in the past. Like, Noah turning into a Wirren in the Ark in Space is particularly disgusting. And it's not that Rob Shearman's done anything particularly more graphic than Target has done before. Just not my cup of tea. I suppose the criticism I would have off the back of that, which I think is slightly more than just me not enjoying it, is that by filling the novel with so much backstory that the Doctor and Rose in particular feel very sidelined. When the TV version, Rose is front and centre, and the Doctor dealing with the aftermath of the Time War are very much part of what's going on. But because they are absent, understandably, from all the bits of backstory, they are in the novel less as a proportion of the action than they are in the TV version. Now, obviously, because he's very kindly numbered all the chapters from the TV bit, and then each chapter of backstory is labelled as so-and-so's tale. So we have the Torturer's Tale, for example, which explains why Simmons is called Simmons and why he's such a nasty piece of work. So what in future readings of the book, it's possible I could just be like, well, let's just read all the numbered chapters, and you would read those 100 pages and you get the TV version. I might try that. That might be a better experience of the novel. Overall, both interesting takes on their respective TV versions. I enjoyed The Crimson Horror much more than I enjoyed its TV counterpart. I enjoyed Dalek a lot less than I enjoyed its TV counterpart. They're still both interesting additions to the Target range. So that's those. I will be back next time to talk about Some Douglas Adams in target form.